Hello and welcome to Community Forum. My name is Wayne Pomianski and I'm delighted to be hosting today's program. We are joined, as we are periodically, by Senator Brian A. Joyce. Senator Joyce currently represents the Norfolk, Bristol, and Plymouth District, which includes Avon, Braintree, Canton, East Bridgewater, Easton, Milton, Randolph, Sharon, Stoughton, and West Bridgewater. Senator Joyce is Senate Chair of the Committee on Bonding, Capital Expenditures, and State Assets, as well as the Senate Vice Chair of the Joint Committee on Healthcare Financing and the Financial Services Committee. He is also a member of the Senate Committees on Ways and Means, Economic Development and Emerging Technologies, and Elder Affairs. Senator Joyce is a graduate of Boston College School of Management and a magna cum laude graduate of Suffolk University Law School, where he served as an editor of the Law Review. He is a practicing attorney who has taught both at the graduate and undergraduate levels. Senator Joyce and his wife Mary have 5 children. Again, welcome back to Community Forum.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Good to have you. We usually start our program, Senator, with asking you to kind of give us an overview of how the Commonwealth is doing.
Well, we're doing better, I think, than the last time I was here. The state has weathered the recession, I think, better than most states. Our economy is clearly improving, but it's a somewhat incremental improvement. It's not the robust growth that we've seen in other recoveries from recessions. It's a slow and plodding ahead growth, and it's a still somewhat tenuous recovery. But nevertheless, things are better. More people are working. The tax revenues, for example, the receipts for April were significantly higher than they were in April of last year. We've, as of last year, still not reached the level we had been at in fiscal 2008. So we had fewer tax dollars and we were trying to do more things, and that was a difficult number of years. I think we've weathered that economic storm better than most states, in fact, perhaps better than any other state in the union. And I'm cautiously optimistic as we move ahead.
Excellent. Of course, we've all been riveted in the last few weeks on the events surrounding the bombing at the Boston Marathon. Does that event have an impact on the legislative agenda at all, would you say?
Sure. I was thinking about this, and we were having a conversation in the State House recently, just talking first about in addition to the extraordinary human toll going back to September 11th of 2001, the economic toll that extraordinarily tragic day in American history had is incalculable. You see it in a million different ways. If I'm going to the Red Sox game tonight. If you park, there might be someone there looking in your trunk to make sure you don't have an explosive device. It takes longer to get through the airport, and the expenses borne by government and business now for security, it's truly incalculable, and the economic impact is hard to assess. The most recent tragedy, the Marathon Day bombing, where fortunately there was far less loss of life than there was on September 11th, but still some extraordinary human tragedy, did not seem to have as much of an economic impact. We didn't see the widespread, paralysis that we saw after September 11th, and it seemed to be contained. It was just the isolated act of a couple of jerks. And nevertheless, it is always an opportunity for us to look and see how we can further enhance public safety, how we in the legislative arena can ensure that they have the proper funding to ensure the public safety. I mean, really, when you think about the functions of government, they're pretty basic. I sometimes am a critic when government gets into things that it doesn't belong in, and the government shouldn't be running hockey rinks, in my opinion, or golf courses, because they do it badly. But public safety,
Yes.
Public roads, public schools, I mean, those are the core and essential functions of government, the reason that government really exists. And so we definitely have a role to ensure adequate funding to give the trained public safety professionals the tools they need to ensure our safety.
Indeed, and I was, we've talked in the past, and I do enjoy talk radio, although it's shrunk in this market in recent months. But I was happy to hear some of the commentary from folks that were calling in to some of the talk radio programs about their gratitude toward public servants, police, fire, EMS, who responded courageously, really, in the aftermath of that bombing. I was in Colorado that particular week, and it is truly a global story, and all of the networks, of course, were covering the events immediately after the bombing, and I think Boston certainly, and its public servants did a splendid job in responding to such a horrific situation.
There were, in my opinion, there were a million examples of, I mean, certainly hundreds and hundreds of examples of acts of kindness as well as heroism. And certainly we saw the public safety officials putting themselves right into the harm's way in order to protect the rest of us. We also saw just kind individuals at the marathon finish line. Some were medical professionals, doctors and nurses and other folks with some experience who had actually been running the race or may have been there to treat people for things like cramps or dehydration. And we just saw some really incredible public spiritedness. And so, for all the focus on these two jerks, we really should focus on all the good and all the incredibly brave and kind people that responded. And that is the great majority of the American people.
Absolutely. Boston strong.
Boston
right?
strong, right.
For sure. Let's shift our conversation a little bit to transportation, in particular the Senate Transportation Plan. I know that the Senate passed its own version of a transportation funding plan for the Commonwealth, but it does differ from the governor's proposal. How so, and why?
Sure. Well, here's the thing. It's funny that over the past 10 years, and probably predating my tenure historically, legislators are criticized for not for raising taxes, for putting an undue tax burden on the public. This was really the extraordinary situation where we were receiving criticism for not raising taxes to the extent the governor had suggested. The governor was suggesting a $1.9 billion tax increase, and made a very good point that we have this pent-up demand for transportation infrastructure improvements, primarily some money for education as well. It was primarily earmarked for transportation infrastructure improvements, and it's clear throughout the last 50, 75, 100 years, the transportation infrastructure has been neglected. And it's important to make an investment so as to have our highways and byways and public transportation and trains and MBTA and the like operating efficiently, not just for residents but also for business. Nevertheless, there were a number of us that took real exception to the governor's plan. There were a couple of things in particular that I could point out. One was it relied on what were referred to as revenue anticipation notes. In other words, we were spending money that, or he wanted to spend money that we would receive from the federal government in 2 years. That's just not a way to operate government. That's like, credit card spending, or
right.
And it's the kind of fuzzy math that was used during the Big Dig era.
Voodoo economics.
Well,
right?
But it was what was done in the Big Dig era, and I chair the bonding committee, as you mentioned, where the transportation bond bill, was filed, and have no interest in engaging in those fiscal shenanigans. Second, very, very concerned with the tax burden that our residents already are bearing. For example, we saw that, just taking all the communities where this program airs, over the past 10 years, property values went up very, very modestly, but property taxes went up not so modestly. And so I had communities where property taxes coupled with the Community Preservation Act may have increased the local burden by, I don't know if it was 50% or something. They had higher water and sewer bills. They had higher utility bills, gas, electric, cable television. Meanwhile, their property values may have gone up 10%, 15%. Food costs have gone up. And we just had the expiration of the federal tax, the so-called Bush-era tax cuts in January. So an average family in my district saw already about a $1,600 federal tax increase in January. The average household income, taking into account the 10 communities I represent, is about $80,000. So taking that average, they've already borne quite a bit of tax increase on the federal level and have seen their cost of living rise so that their real income has diminished, I think by the federal estimate, as much as 10% during those years. So we took all that into account, as well as the governor's well-founded position that we needed to make some targeted investments. And we did have a far more modest plan pass. And I think it's a very positive step. We are making targeted investments in infrastructure, but really, I think I'm of the mind that we should fix what we have first before we embark on a whole lot of new expenditures. In this area, there's a lot of discussion on the Fall River New Bedford line,
Yes.
which is estimated to cost some $3 billion. My sense is that the true cost will be far in excess of that.
Sure. Always is.
It always is. My sister made a point, which I thought was very well put. She said, shouldn't we fix the existing house before we look to build an addition? So you look at the state of the MBTA that we have currently in operation and look at the state of our current road and bridges. It seems to me we ought to fix that first before we embark on significant expansions. The other thing, the governor had filed this transportation bond bill, which would have encumbered our future taxpayers as far out as 2053. In other words, wanted to make decisions now that we would be paying for 40 years hence. That struck me as way too much. I'm very concerned that we in Massachusetts have the highest debt per capita of any state in the union. We have, as of January, about $21 billion in outstanding debt. That does not take into account about another $24 billion in unfunded pension liabilities, as much as another $46 billion in unfunded retiree health care benefit liabilities, and doesn't take into account municipal and county debt. Now, that's particularly dry, particularly boring, but also particularly important. It's funny, in my business, Wayne, if some fellow, some obscure backbench representative files a bill having to do with transgender access to a bathroom, something that impacts 6 people in the state at most. It's important to those folks, but in the grand scheme of things, not going to impact our daily life. That will get all kinds of press coverage, but things that I think are far more significant, such as the legacy of debt that we are giving to our children and their children and their children, gets scant coverage. That tends to be more where I focus, and I think that is one of the reasons, the concern of increased debt, the concern of this fragile recovery and not overburdening taxpayers, that we didn't go along with the governor's plan. We passed a far more modest plan.
Mm-hmm. I did wonder, when the governor announced his plans and the $1.9 billion tax increase. I mean, I know from my corporate experience, when you're negotiating budgets, sometimes you'll ask for the sun, the earth, and the moon, but your real goal is just the earth. And whether part of that was I guess we'll never really know, second-term governor not running for re-election, whether he sort of aimed high with the expectation that he's not going to get everything he asked for, and maybe the real goal was something considerably less than that, which he can hammer out with you folks in the legislature.
I think that's a very fair point, and I give the governor credit for shifting the conversation to this acute need we have to address our crumbling transportation infrastructure. Again, not terribly sexy, not terribly exciting, but terribly important. So I give him a lot of credit for shifting the debate. In fact, the bully pulpit that he uses so effectively, his personal popularity, again, put us in that situation where we were debating not whether to increase taxes, but for the most part, it was how much. And folks that wanted a very modest increase were viewed as, as quite conservative. Whereas in another state, I think they'd be viewed as, liberal because they wanted to raise taxes at all. But I give him credit for shifting the terms of the debate to this important area. There is a lot to be said. Over the last 6 or 7 years, we had taken great steps to streamline the operation of government so that it is more efficient than it was before. There are fewer bureaucracies. There used to be, I think, 7 different transportation agencies. We don't have that anymore. Certainly, there's a lot more we can do to be more efficient and effective with the taxpayers' dollars, but we've taken good steps, and there is a need to invest in our infrastructure. So I think you're right. There was some of that, that a little bit of posturing, aiming high. Nevertheless, I think where we end up, he should declare victory and move on. And I suspect that's what they'll do.
Is the governor still threatening a veto, or is that pretty much going by the wayside?
Well, I think he was unhappy with the House plan, less unhappy with the Senate plan. The conference committee is now working out the differences, so it remains to be seen. I suspect he would not exercise such a veto, and if he did, it would likely be readily overridden. It'd be close, but I suspect it would be overridden.
So I think what I think I hear you saying is this year anyway, probably no transportation bond bill.
No, it would be a very significant transportation bond bill. As I said, we have about 21, almost $22 billion in outstanding bond obligations. Now, I don't want to be too alarmist because, in fact, just, 18 months ago or so, our bond rating was raised. I think we were the only state in the country at that time to have our bond rating raised. So we are doing some things well. We have done some significant public pension reform, for example, curbing the abuses, reducing the expenditure to folks that perhaps weren't deserving of their inflated pension. So we've taken some steps that helped improve our bond rating. I'm just suggesting there's more that can be done. Again, to safeguard our financial future for our children and their children. We have some statutory limits that limit the amount of money that the state can borrow. Those really haven't been updated in a number of years. There's a concern, it was a great line from a former secretary in this administration, the cabinet secretary, who said, we were like the College of Cardinals, but the governor was like the Pope, and so the Pope is infallible. And so here's the point. The administration alone shouldn't be deciding how much the public can afford to bear in terms of borrowing. There's pressure on every governor of both parties to create a legacy and to get all these projects done, whether it's the South Station or the Green Line extension or the Fall River to Bedford line or a train from Pittsfield to New York or whatever the heck it is. There's pressure to have these legacy projects. We have a fiduciary obligation to ensure it's things that we can afford. So at the Senate behest in an initiative that I sponsored, we've just created a Capital Debt Affordability Commission. We've brought in experts from outside of government to look at this pension, this capital debt and ensure that we can afford it and that we're not overburdening. I sit on that commission. Again, I recognize if you're still paying attention, this is really boring stuff, but it's important. It's real important.
Well, obviously, I guess at some level it could be considered boring. Yet when we sit down on April 15th and calculate our state and federal taxes, that's when the chickens come home to roost.
And it's also, let me just add one.
Sure.
It's also how you frame the issue.
Yeah.
If a conservative might say, hey, let's limit government spending, a more progressive person might say, hey, if we're spending too much money to service this debt, that doesn't leave enough money to fund our, the items that our collective values suggest we support. So it can be framed either way, but for conservatives and progressives alike, for all of us, it's important that we not overextend ourselves financially.
Mm-hmm. I think in that regard too, again, sort of looking at the public discourse, there seems to be growing awareness that there are fewer people, for a variety of reasons, the meltdown in 2008, the emergence of technology eliminating certain jobs, more recently, I think there's been a lot of visibility given to the fact that there are fewer people working now to support Social Security payments. I was listening to a financial pundit this morning driving to Stoughton, and he commented on a recent survey to the effect that a number of years ago there were 50 workers for every person receiving federal disability benefits. Now the ratio is 13 workers to support each person receiving federal disability benefits. And this seems to be the trend that is emerging. It does create, I guess, a debate around the issue of givers and takers. We saw that bubble up during the presidential campaign. But I think certainly in a legislative position that you occupy as chairman of a committee and co-chair of other committees, is there a sense in the legislature and hopefully in the executive branch here in Massachusetts that there's only so much that can be extracted from the working public to support all of the needs that presumably are crying out for fiscal support?
No question. There's no question. Now, first you talked about a couple things. You talked about the federal level and the state
Yes,
level. And
yep.
I can't speak necessarily
No,
to
I
the federal
understand.
level, but I can just give a couple of observations.
But the same issue exists in
No
the
question.
state.
First, with respect to state employees in Massachusetts, it's important for folks to realize with respect to pension benefits for current employees, they are essentially paying their way. Public employees in Massachusetts are not in the Social Security system.
Yes, right.
And so public employees in Massachusetts contribute toward their own pension. There's a misconception that the rank and file public employee is really just cashing in on their pensions. It's honestly not the case with respect to pension benefits of current employees. We require them to contribute significantly, as much as 11%, in some instances 13% of their pay goes toward their retirement benefits. On the federal level, talking about Social Security and talking about benefits in general, it is absolutely an issue that we have fewer people paying into the system. We also have other issues that you didn't touch upon. We have changing demographics. We have an aging population. Mm-hmm. We have people living longer. So if you look at the economy of Japan, now there's great fear of the Chinese economy, which is projected to perhaps overtake the American economy in the next 20 or 30 years as the #1 economy in the world. It's now the #2 economy. Well, it surpassed Japan. And if you remember back in the 80s, we were all fearful of Japan.
Yes, right.
And they were the rising power. They've gone through some serious economic turmoil in the last couple of decades, or the last decade at least. Part of it is driven by their demographic trend. They are the oldest population on Earth. And they're also a very homogeneous population that's been resistant to immigration and to introducing non-Japanese indigenous people into their culture and their economy. I think that on the national level, ultimately, the immigration debate is going to become more and more of an economic debate. We need younger workers. We need some of the talented workers, not folks that are going to drain and take our benefits, but folks that will contribute to our economy to help sustain our standard of living. And that's something that doesn't get discussed enough about. We also, I think, need to look at raising retirement ages. We've taken some modest steps, but the reality is, I think there's a billboard on the expressway for a retirement plan that says something like 1 out of 3 persons born today will live to 100. When the old age pension was passed during the Roosevelt administration, the life expectancy wasn't much beyond the 65 where you became eligible. So we've raised it, I think, at my age, I'm 50, I think I wouldn't be able to collect until I was 67. It's been raised modestly. I think it has to be raised more. I think on the federal level, there should be some means testing for the Medicare benefit. There isn't now, so that health care benefit is available to those who need it, but not necessarily free for those who don't. But on the state level, with respect to our reform efforts, for pension, you can't change the rules once someone is vested. They have a vested right. So if someone's been working in the state system for 10 years, we can't suddenly say, you deserve a lesser pension, we're going to cut it. That just isn't permitted by law. It's a breach of contract and of a vested right. What we can look at is what's referred to as OPEB, O-P-E-B, other post-employment benefits, primarily health care.
Right.
And that's where I mentioned, I think as of January of this year, the state had about a $46 billion unfunded OPEB liability. It's an extraordinary burden that I think is going to burst in the future unless we address it. Cities and towns have the same thing. Now, we've seen in California, some municipalities actually go into bankruptcy. I think one of them was Stockton, California, and it was primarily driven by these requirements to pay retired public employees and police and fire and the like. We have to take a hard and fast look at that, and particularly change the way we pay folks coming into the system. Folks coming in now would enter a system where the rules are clear and they know that they need to be socking away money for their own post-retirement health care costs and the like. But that's important stuff. Boring as heck, but important. And that's a lot of what my the committee I chair focuses on, these future debt obligations.
So would you say, and again, I understand the legislative session is underway, when we're not close to where things are being tied up and put a bow on, so to speak. But at this point, do you envision a small increase in the state income tax? I know the governor had proposed a reduction in the state sales tax. If you were a betting person, what do you think will be the outcome? Is there enough information out there to project what do you think is going to happen?
My guess is that there will not be a small increase in the income tax, and there may. Does
that mean a bigger increase, or maybe there's no increase?
My guess is there'd be no increase. I don't think there's sufficient support for that. It's interesting. There are an awful lot of people pushing for very big tax increases. I just don't see it as a majority. I don't support that myself. I think our recovery is too fragile. The best thing we can do is grow our economy so that, in fact, increases tax receipts as more people are working, more people are making more money. We've been fortunate recently that the stock market has improved, so our capital gains tax receipts are improving. But my sense is that there is likely to be about a 3-cent tax increase on gas which hasn't gone up in some, I don't know, 21 or 22 years or something like that. And that may be indexed going forward. So there are going to be some modest increases, I suspect, many of which have fairly broad support, but I think it's going to be more modest. It's going to be more in the nature of the $650 million or so rather than the 1.9. As a practical matter to the individual watching at home, I think it's going to be almost something they don't even notice. I mean, I think it's going to be pretty modest.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good to hear. What about education? I know education is a priority of yours. Do you see level funding in terms of aid to schools, state colleges, UMass? I mean, it sounds from what you said, Senator Joyce, that obviously there's a lot of attention being paid to budget issues. What can you tell us about funding for schools this year?
Let me go back to that tax issue, by the way. So I think for the average driver next year, they may see about a $12 to $30 increase in their gas tax during the course of the year. Mm-hmm. That's about it. There is going to be an increased tax, I suspect, on tobacco products, and I believe that the utilities that have gotten away with not paying fees for right-of-ways across public lands and the like, I think they're going to be looking at an increase. That was essentially the Senate plan. In terms of education, so in 1993, before my time, the Education Reform Act was passed, which dramatically increased the requirements and the efforts to improve our public schools. And it was hand in hand with a dramatic increase in public funding. And since that time, we've increased funding for our public schools by billions of dollars. So, here in Stoughton, we may be looking at, I think it's about $15 million in state assistance, and Easton it may be almost 10 million, and Avon closer to $1 million, kind of driven largely by population, in school-age population, and it's formulaic, but we have dramatically increased the investment in our public schools, and as I said, at the same time, we've increased the requirements and what we expect, not just for the benefit of the taxpayers, but really for the benefit of the school children who are competing now in a global economy. We mentioned Japan and China, and the children getting out of school in whether it's Stoughton High School or Oliver Ames or Avon High or wherever else this show runs, Milton High or Braintree, they are as apt to be competing with someone across the world as they are with someone across the state. And it really is a rapidly changing world. So the challenge for our educators is to give these children the skill set that they'll need to adapt quickly, because things change so quickly now.
Very fast.
The pace of change is extraordinary. The manufacturing is actually returning here to Massachusetts and here to the United States. There's a couple of reasons for that. We saw our manufacturing base erode precipitously and go to China, to Vietnam, the Philippines, elsewhere where they had low-cost labor. Now we've seen, with the extraordinary advances in technology, labor is actually less important, unskilled labor. It's skilled labor that can operate this extraordinarily sophisticated machinery. Some of it's used right here in our industrial parks, right here in Stoughton, right here in Canton, right here in Avon. There are some extraordinary things going on that require very skilled workers, and those jobs can actually pay pretty well. Now, the unfortunate thing is they need fewer people.
Right.
But those that have the requisite skill set can do quite well. So, and then there's other, we've mentioned in the past, the biotech industry in Massachusetts, the companies like Organogenesis in Canton that are essentially manufacturing or regenerative medicine, they call it, creating new skin
Yes.
from cells. I mean, really extraordinary stuff. We are investing significantly in schools. We'll continue to do so. I think the local schools will again see an increase in state funding, albeit modest, just constrained by the fiscal realities. But I think there'll be a modest increase over the funding for last year.
Excellent. What about aid to cities and towns in terms of infrastructure? That would be Chapter 90 funding?
Chapter 90. So that comes through my committee as well. We actually just increased the amount going back to cities and towns for roads and bridges by 50% this year. And 2 years ago, increased it by 38%. So the local DPW directors should be happy.
This is good.
There's money coming back for cities and towns. And that's good. I mean, again, it's not just... it improves the roads and bridges for local citizenry. It also is a good little economic development tool. It creates thousands of construction projects throughout the state. So it's all good. So we've put more and more money into that in recent years.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like what I think I hear you saying is moderation. The legislature is very cognizant of the realities of the economy. It's getting better. But it's a slow, gradual process. We need to use discretion in terms of all the demands for funding that exists from year to year, and not get way ahead of ourselves in terms of, creating obligations that go out to 2053, that sort of thing.
Exactly. I mean, that's very well put. I don't consider myself a particularly liberal or a particularly conservative individual in terms of spending. In terms of social issues, I'm more libertarian, live and let live. But in terms of my role as at least one of the stewards of the public purse, I see that I have a real fiduciary obligation. And that doesn't mean, a Pavlovian response in opposition to any spending. But it is, when we spend money, it should be money that's spent wisely and results in a return to the taxpayers and to help our economy. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a little business district in Milton at Central Avenue that was, I think, fairly dilapidated. And we made a targeted investment of $1 million in state funds for what's called a MassWorks grant, and we've done them throughout the district. We've done them in Canton and Stoughton and Sharon and Easton, and we've done them throughout the district. But this one I watched very closely because it's near my house, and we coupled it with the town rezoning for mixed use, and that investment spurred private investment. Now we see this new restaurant, we see other new businesses, and we see that whole area has just popped. Property values, residential property values in that area have gone up. The commercial values have gone up, so they're paying more into taxes. There are meals tax generated. So it's generating a return to the taxpayers as well as improving the quality of life. I look at downtown Easton, and we had the historic Ames Shovel Works that was threatened with being bulldozed by a couple of local developers that were perhaps not attuned to the extraordinarily historic significance of that Ames Shovel Works, where there was mass production of the old Ames shovel some 50 years before Henry Ford. I mean, extraordinary place.
Very historic.
In utilizing, Dave Colton, the local town administrator, and Colin Corona and the other select persons have done a great job in working with a developer, but also accessing state funds. We've had an extraordinary investment of state funds to leverage with some private investment by a developer and the local investment, perhaps through the Community Preservation Act and elsewhere, kind of a complicated but a true public-private partnership. And I think it's going to revitalize downtown Easton for the next 150 years, or at least the next 100 years. It's an extraordinary project. if and when we do get to the Fall River, New Bedford line, which is so important to the folks that live down in southeastern Mass and Fall River, New Bedford, they see that as the holy grail for their economic recovery. I think it's going to present an opportunity for a place like Stoughton that has a beautiful train station in the center of town. I think it gives an opportunity for Stoughton to get some targeted state investment that again will leverage significant private investment. And so rather than necessarily looking at it as something that is going to be bad news, I think there's an opportunity there for the town. But it's I think a little bit off in the future, and I think it's important that we be on top of it. So you put it very well. My sense is that we're in a fragile recovery. We are recovering. We are increasing spending, but we need to be judicious so as to not overextend ourselves. And that money we spend, we have to ensure it's spent wisely and reaps returns to the taxpayers.
Well, I think the best advice of all probably came from your sister, which, I think the analogy of, let's repair the existing structure before we put on an addition. And I think a lot of rank and file voters, whether they characterize themselves as moderates, conservatives, liberals, I think most people would tend to agree with that. We've talked a lot about expenditures, education, infrastructure, and so forth. I'm just wondering on the receipt side, revenues coming into the state, is there anything new to report about casinos? I mean, I see in the news recently, New Hampshire, I guess, is trumpeting plans to build a casino in Salem. It seems like, are they going to beat us to the punch, so to speak, adversely affect the potential future for casinos here in Massachusetts because it's taking us a long time to really move forward on casinos? Is there any news to report in that space, or?
Well, I'd rather move slowly than
Yeah.
make mistakes. I will confess that in my time in office, that's probably the vote that I'm least proud of. I felt I'm not a big supporter, candidly, of casino gambling, and really not necessarily for moral issues. I don't think it's my place to pass any judgment whatsoever. But I think for economic issues, I'm not real keen on it. I think it has somewhat of a adverse impact on those persons that have gambling issues. I think it feeds those. It's disruptive to families, and it takes income away from other businesses and other ways to spend discretionary income. That being said, I felt that we had no choice because the federal government had recognized the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and had given them the federal tribal recognition, and were likely to follow quickly with the next step, which was to put the land in trust. And at that point, under federal law, the Native American tribe, the Mashpee Wampanoag, would be able to open a casino or gambling parlor, and the state would have very little control over it and regulatory control, and would not share in the revenue. So we really didn't have much choice if we wanted to jump out in front on this to both control the regulatory environment and also to collect a share for the state. So we did pass this legislation, and it really, through the process, morphed from that one casino to now having several, potentially. And I know that Senator Rosenberg, who kind of shepherded this through the Senate, spent a couple of years trying to develop the best practices from the other states. I mean, we have one form or another of gambling in about 46 states in this union.
Right.
It's not just Atlantic City and Las Vegas anymore. So he really did try to, and collectively we tried to incorporate the best practices to limit the preying on vulnerable folks with gambling issues and a whole host of issues. And then what we did, Wayne, is we gave it to an independent board. We don't want this in the legislature. That's where we've seen corruption in other states. Mm-hmm. We've seen the undue influence of money, of these moneyed interests. So we've turned it over to an independent commission, and they are proceeding deliberately, and I'm delighted they are doing so and trying to do it right. So ultimately, we could end up with as many as 3 so-called destination casinos, and at one of the racetracks, a slot parlor. So we expect it will generate hundreds of millions of dollars for the state coffers. As I say, it's not quite that simple because it's taking money from other expenditures, but
a net gain.
It is a net gain economically, but at a cost. But again, the way that it was situated with the federal government, I think we had no choice but to do something.
Okay, very good. Well, I appreciate the update. Let's talk a little bit about the environment. I think you've been involved in legislation that pertains to the possible elimination of plastic bags in grocery stores. And there's been a little bit of an upheaval in a town that I live close to, Concord, where the local representation elected to get rid of the smaller plastic bottles, for water, and that's created a bit of an uproar. What about the plastic grocery bags? Is that
it's funny
really going to happen? Or?
It is happening to a certain extent. The market forces. If you go to Whole Foods, you'll see a lot of people bringing in their own shopping bag, and if not, they accept paper. And I think there's even a discount at Stop and Shop if you bring in your own bag. Market forces are taking care of that a little bit, but a growing awareness that these plastic bags can be around for. Some folks say they
forever.
Some folks say they take 1,000 years. I don't know who's around to check, but to break down. We all come to the legislature with our own personal experience. An extraordinarily important item to me was home care for seniors, and my own mother, who's been gone 6 years yesterday, she suffered from Parkinson's disease at the end, and she was benefited immensely by our home care workers. And Mary and I lived next door and were able to help out a little bit with my dad. My sisters was wonderful, and my family members. And my father was just such an incredibly devoted husband. But we also had these home care workers, and it's always been an important item to me. And I suspect when you see the Senate budget released this year, you're going to see more funding for home care for our seniors who want to remain in their own home and not be sent prematurely to a nursing home. And so we all come to the legislature with our own personal experiences. Well, my wife happens to be, I used to tell her 20 years ago, she was the recycling queen of Milton. And I think back in the day when they were collecting all the recycling, I think the guy at the dump was just taking it and putting it in with the other stuff. But
we hope not.
But in any event, it was my daughter Maggie, who's now 21 years old, had called to my attention, she and my wife, the dangers of these plastic bags. In fact, Maggie, when she was in the 6th grade, I introduced a bill to ban the styrofoam cups that are also petroleum-based. And the folks from Dunkin' Donuts, it's in my district, came to me and said, "Oh, please, no." But they are, in fact, working on a more environmentally sound cup. And so sometimes there's an opportunity to nudge them along a little bit. I got another important environmental bill, and one that I'm working quite hard on. That is to create, we've spent a lot of time in recent years on these new, clean, renewable forms of energy, things like solar and wind. Where the real savings is, more than all that, is to reduce the energy expenditures for our existing commercial and industrial properties. So we have these huge companies like Johnson Controls and Honeywell and some others that are able to come into, say, a city or town and say, hey, we can reduce your expenditures on energy by 30%. And they come in and they retrofit the building, they change the light bulbs, they change the boiler, they do a lot of things. It's really limited to the big players that have the financial wherewithal. So I'm unveiling a plan that I've worked on for 2 years, worked with a lot of very smart people, to provide, at no cost to the taxpayers, by the way, bonding from Mass Development, a quasi-public agency, a available source of funds for small contractors to access, in small commercial and industrial property owners to access, like in this building owner, to go in and retrofit their building beyond just light bulbs, but really reduce energy consumption, which has an extraordinary effect on our economy. I think this legislation could create, a conservative estimate is as many as 10,000 jobs in Massachusetts just by providing this ready access to capital. Again, there'll be no taxpayer cost. In fact, there'd be a modest return, but it's going to be low interest money, say less than 3%. And then we have the other effect of reducing our carbon emissions, reducing our carbon footprint. And so it's really, truly a win-win.
I was going to say, it sounds like a win-win.
And if
Let me just take a minute. I want to make sure we get our announcements in before we run out of time. But again, it's heartening to see that you and the legislature are also looking at environmental issues that have the potential to help the environment as well as reduce costs of, say, manufacturing.
Well, this one, I'll tell you just quickly, this one has some other impact because these aren't jobs that you can ship off to China.
Right,
so it's
right.
our local tradesmen that have been hard hit in recent years, harder hit than some other sectors in terms of employment. It creates jobs. They buy their supplies locally.
Sure.
So that creates jobs at those local stores. So it has really a multiplier effect. So it's good for our economy. It's good for our environment.
Excellent, excellent. Definitely something to be pushed. Let's take a minute or two to make sure that we get through some announcements we want to get out to folks. In terms of contacting Senator Joyce, he obviously works out of the State House in Boston. His email address is brian.a.joyce@masssenate.gov. Phone number is 617-722-1643 or brianajoyce.com. The crew would like to thank Maxie's Delicatessen at 117 Sharon Street in Stoughton for great goodies that they provide to all of our taping sessions for both the staff as well as our guests. Maxie's. Phone number 781-341-1662. The American Cancer Society is looking for volunteers to drive cancer patients to and from treatments. If it's something that you might be able to participate in, dial 1-800-ACS-6662, on the web, www.cancer.org. The Ilsa Marks Food Pantry and St. Anthony's Free Market, First United Methodist Church, also seeking volunteers to help with their programs. The contact is Christine Gallagher. You can reach Christine at 781-341-0611 or 781-341-0549. Meals on Wheels also seeking volunteers. Contact is Jessica. Phone number there is 781-344-8882 and extension 2. Stoughton Penny Saver, our business is advertising your business. Be sure to take advantage of this opportunity to get some visibility for your particular firm. They are located at 27 Rose Glen Street in Stoughton. You can reach them at 781-344-4833. International Forum Show, as well as our program, Community Forum, Sundays 2 p.m., Monday 11 p.m., Wednesday 9 a.m., Saturday 12 noon, Comcast Channel 9, Verizon Channel 28. And Community Forum showtimes Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at 6 p.m., Monday at 8 p.m., Tuesday at 5 p.m., Comcast Channel 9, again, Verizon Channel 28. We always welcome comments and suggestions to reach out to us. On the web, we are at communityforum1@yahoo.com. In Easton, our program is also broadcast weekly, Monday at 9 p.m., Tuesday at 8 a.m., Friday 4 p.m., Saturday at 3 p.m., Comcast Channel 9, Verizon Channel 22, and again, comments, welcome, suggestions, communityforum1@yahoo.com. Okay, I think that takes care of it in terms of announcements. We have about 3 minutes left. Senator Joyce, I always like to talk a little bit about politics. We have a Senate race coming up. The latest, I guess, surveys indicate that Congressman Markey seems to be pulling away from Mr. Gomez. What are your thoughts? Any thoughts about the race for replacing John Kerry?
Well, I want to mention and give a shout out to Stoughton's own Mo Cowan, who did replace John Kerry, is the interim U.S. Senator.
Yes, indeed, that's right.
Mo Cowan's a good guy from Stoughton and is serving ably as the interim U.S. Senator, and to his credit, didn't get Potomac fever and decided he wanted to be a candidate.
Right.
He said he was going down there just to work hard and cover it that short period of time, and bless him, he has. So I think we've had some very good candidates step forward on both the Republican and Democratic side. Not surprisingly, I'm supporting Ed Markey, the Democrat, but I think that Gomez seems to have an interesting and compelling life story as well. The interesting thing is, to me, and perhaps the unfortunate thing, is the extraordinary influence of money in politics.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Gomez won on the Republican side because he was the candidate who was able to reach into his own pocket and fund advertising. Mike Sullivan, who had a breadth of experience, and Dan Winslow, also a capable person, just didn't have the dough. And the result is Mr. Gomez won. On the Democratic side, same thing. Congressman Markey had more funds, and so this isn't necessarily a partisan shot, but just really a sad and sober reality, the extent to which money matters in politics. I don't know that we're ever going to change that legislatively. My hope and expectation is that actually we're going to change it through advances in technology, which will give persons that don't have the money to pay for expensive television advertising an opportunity to reach out to voters maybe through the internet and the like. But that's just one observation. My sense is that we on the state level, I have some extraordinarily great friendships with the Republicans across the aisle. Like, we're all in this together, and I wish we would get that in Washington. Republican, Democrat, or Independent, we're all Americans and should be working toward a common goal. We see too much divisiveness, in my opinion, and we see too much, again, of the pervasive influence of money. Anytime you try to make a change, there's somebody who's resistant to that change.
I think on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. We want to thank Senator Joyce for joining us. We covered a lot of ground. We have a good update in terms of what's happening in the Massachusetts legislature in your district. Again, I'm assuming you've decided still not to throw your hat in the ring for the governor role. I always ask you that question.
Well, my wife is telling me I got to wear a hat when I'm out in the ball field coaching my baby, my 15-year-old son's Babe Ruth team. I'm the assistant coach, by the way. I'm not.
There you go.
But I'm getting too much sun. That's the only hat I'm
That's the only hat going in the ring. Well, Senator Joyce, thank you very much.
Sure.
We look forward to future discussions here in Community Forum.
My pleasure.